All right. I hope you guys enjoy that music. I know I did. Guys, thank you so much for being here today. We are here all together celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month. We have a great guest today. I'll tell you more about her in a bit. She has quite the resume. But thank you so much, everybody, from being here. My name is Juan Giraldo. I'm a senior loan officer for Atlantic Bay Mortgage, but I'm also your diversity lending ambassador. Um, I wanted to share some information with you guys, some data that I think is really cool since we're celebrating this Hispanic Heritage Month. This data is coming from the NAREB report from 2023, and it's something to be very proud about, by the way. I know I am. So let me tell you this, guys. The Hispanic ownership rate reached a 49.5% in 2023. That's the largest increase in home ownership rate across racial or ethnic demographic groups. Um, Latinos added a net gain of 377,000 owner households, the largest single year gain since 2005. Think about that for a moment. 31.7% of Latinos are among the most likely demographic to live in a multi-generational household. Let that sink in for a moment. Um, I wanted to share this. I heard this the other day. I went to an event a couple of days ago. Did you know, listen to this, did you know that the average non-Latino family in the United States, right? The average non-Latino family in the United States right now has a 1.3 kids per household, right? That's the average family in the United States, non-Latino. Do you know how many kids Latinos are having per household? Listen, I know Laura is smiling. um, 4.3%, right? The reason I get excited about this is because of, think about this for a moment. We are having more kids than any other demographic, but these are the same kids. This is the same generations that are growing in a household where their parents own that home. What do you think is going to happen with those kids? Their parents are going to teach them how to purchase. They're going to advise them to, hey, buy a home. So this data, these numbers that we're sharing with you are only going to continue to go up and go up and go up. The Latino community is the largest demographic or the minor with the most purchase power in the US right now for, I believe, 5 to 6 years in a row. That's something to be extremely, extremely proud. I wanted to share some information regarding our guest today. Her name is Laura. I'm going to say Laura Arce. Um, she is in Washington, D.C. Right now, and she's joining us today, and she's going to be sharing some amazing information. Let me give you a little bit of background about Laura, and bear with me because her resume is quite the resume. Laura Arce is a senior vice president of economics initiatives at the Unidos U.S., the nation's largest Hispanic civil rights and advocacy organization. She's the architect of the Home Ownership Means Equity Home Initiative, a multi-year movement to transform the economic trajectory of the Latino through homeownership. Laura has held senior positions in the private, nonprofit, and public sectors, including at Wells Fargo and Company, the Federal Housing Finance Agency, FHFA, and on Capitol Hill. She's on the board of the Center of Responsible Lending and the National Housing Conference, serves on the FHFA Federal Advisory Committee on Affordable, Equitable, and Sustainable Housing, and the Fannie Mae Affordable Housing Advisory Committee. Lauro is a graduate of the University of California at Berkeley and holds a master's degree in urban planning from Rutgers University. I told you guys, it's quite the resume. Laura, we are so excited to have you here, and please, we give you the floor.
Great. Thank you so much, Juan. I'm going to
You're
pull
welcome.
up my presentation. Hopefully you can see that okay?
We are good.
Yep.
We can see it.
Okay. Excellent.
Right now, we don't see the presentation.
Oh, you don't see it?
No.
Okay, hold on a second. Let me try that again. see.
There you go.
Okay, does that work?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, perfect, perfect. Thank you so much, Juan, for that introduction and getting through all of the acronyms
Yes.
for my career in Washington, D.C. It's the D.C. way. We were joking earlier about the alphabet soup that Washington seems to love to have, this is where I've spent my career. But it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me back. I was here speaking to you all just about a year ago. And so it's a big compliment that for me for you all to invite me a second time. So I appreciate it. So one noted my path, my career path, which has been exclusively in Washington, D.C., and all working on housing and mortgage, mostly on the policy side, but a little bit on the business side. And I've been really fortunate to have done this work from a few different vantage points. So, in the government, with a regulator, in the private sector, and now with a nonprofit. And I wanted to share with you all, maybe just also in addition to, my career, I'm really passionate about this work. And so I just maybe share a little bit something personal for you all to get to know me a little bit. It's some of my why. And so I am technically second generation American. My grandparents came to the US, to California in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And my parents were both young kids. They were both born in Mexico, but they came to the US as young kids, and they, did most of their school here in the US. And, for me, my family's story, I know it's not unique, but it's very much kind of drives what I do today. Because I think back to my grandparents and how hard they worked. My grandfather was, predominantly a manual laborer working in the railroad industry. And my grandmother was a service worker and, cleaned houses. And I think about, the places that I've been able to be, working on Capitol Hill, working in the, with groups like, Atlantic Bay and others. And I think back to the choices that my parents made. And specifically, the two things that they did were, one is they got a college degree, and two, they were the first in our families to buy a house. And for me, I just think at those two decisions that my parents made really bent the trajectory of my future, certainly, but also that of my kids. One talked about that, about kind of that future next generation. And so I know what an impact it's had on me personally and my family. And that's a lot of why I do the work that I do. So I'll kind of go over what I'm going to talk about today. Hold on a second. Sorry, too many screens open. When I joined you all last year, I don't know how many folks were part of that conversation. I talked about some broad trends around Latino homeownership, and I shared with you all an initiative, the Homeownership Means Equity initiative, that at the time was pretty new. We had just kind of launched it publicly, and so I focused a lot more on what our plans were. So this year I thought I would maybe share a few updates on some of those same trends that I talked about last year, because we definitely have seen some movement. And maybe give kind of a quick reminder about Unidos and the Home Initiative, and then share with you what we've been up to and a couple of examples of things we've done the past year, and then maybe a little bit of a sneak peek for what we have in store for the coming year and beyond. So just to make sure, because I'm sure there's some folks who maybe weren't with us last year, I want to share a little bit more about Unidos, where I work. As one shared, we're the largest Latino civil rights organization in the United States. We were established in 1968, so we've been around for over 55 years. And we're headquartered in Washington, D.C. That's where I'm based. And we also have field offices in 4 priority states. So that's California, Arizona, Texas, and in Florida. And we're a multi-issue organization. So I have colleagues who work in other sectors. So for example, health, workforce, education, as well as civic engagement and immigration. And the way that we do or advance the work that we do is focused around a few strategies. And so one is policy and advocacy. A second is research. A through is program work. And then the last item I wanted to note is our affiliate network. And so we're an intermediary, and so we don't provide services directly, we do advocacy, we run programs, but we're not out there working directly with consumers. So instead, we have this affiliate network of, I think right now we're at about 309 organizations. These are independent community-based organizations that are working in their local communities and markets around the issues that we advance at Unidos. And so there are affiliates, and we work very closely. There are ears on the ground in local markets in terms of what are opportunities and what are challenges. And also we support them through helping them get funding for their program work, and then helping to advance the policies that they think need to be changed. If we can be an advocate for them, either in state capitals or in Washington, D.C. So that's broadly what our work is. And so among our priority areas is housing, and specifically homeownership. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about our work specifically in the homeownership space in a moment. But maybe I'll start by giving you a few updates on some of the demographic trends that I pay attention to pretty regularly, and I think build on some of what Juan shared at the start of the call. The first is that, there's a lot of good news related to Latino homeownership. We have seen steady progress and growth in the number and also the rate of Latino homeownership in recent years. And so we're seeing that increase in the homeownership rate, an increase in Latino homeowners, and we're also seeing a closing in that homeownership gap between white households and Latino households, which we think is really great news, because ultimately we would love to just eliminate that gap completely. Another big thing we pay attention to, which I'm sure you all do too, is household formations and homeowners. And so between 2021 and 2022, last year I shared 2021 data with you all, we saw an increase of over 560,000 Latino households, and also over 370,000 Latino homeowners. And so those are really significant numbers between those 2 years, which is really great news. And we also saw a modest increase in the share of Latinos in the prime home buying years, which we define between the ages of 25 and 44. Interestingly, this is something we focus a lot around in terms of just age cohorts. So in the US today, there are over or about 64 million Hispanics across the country. And a few kind of interesting data points about the Latino population. So 72% of Latinos in the US today, so of that 64 million, either speak only English or speak English very well, which is a big increase from what that share was back in 2010. It was 65%. So this kind of goes to the point that Juan was making around that we're seeing increasingly a lot of the growth in the Latino population. It's not from immigration, which I know a lot of people sometimes assume. It's really about demographics and birth rates. US-born Latinos are almost 70% of the Latino population, and 81% of Latinos in the US are US citizens. Another really interesting data point, which I think would be of interest to you all, especially kind of looking at the market going forward, is that our community is young. So the median age of Latinos is about 29 and a half years, compared to 38 years old for the overall US population's median age. And the other interesting thing is that 31% of Hispanic Americans are under the age of 18. So that's almost a third of Latinos are under the age of 18. So you can imagine kind of if you start looking over the next 10, 20 years, they're going to be a greater share of that population. So, maybe a little bit, it's not always all good news. And so, sadly, we have seen denial rates increase, between the 2021 and 2022. And that's been true across the board, not only for Latinos. In 2021, 11% of Hispanics were denied, compared to now just over 19% in the most recent year that I have data for, which is 2022. And I think a lot of that is attributed to that increase in interest rates that we saw, and that certainly wreaked a lot of havoc for folks, especially those who were kind of in the process for buying a home. And so I think that was one of the drivers. But debt to income does remain the #1 denial reason for Latino mortgage applicants. And I'm going to share a little bit more because we've done some research on denial reasons, in particular DTI, which I'll talk about momentarily. And so there's a lot of data out there in terms of demographics and mortgage and the business. And so every now and then I like to kind of pull myself back and just think about, okay, what are some of my big takeaways to help kind of shape and inform the work that I'm doing? And so these are a few things that for me are just the big takeaways. One is the Latino community is younger than the overall US population. And we're also forming households at a larger rate, as well as starting at a younger age, we're forming households. And so I think a lot of that points to that Latinos will continue to be the drivers of homeownership growth in the country. And there's a stat that I share pretty much every time I speak from the Urban Institute that they have forecasted that between 2020 and 2040, Latinos will make up 70% of net new home buyers. Another, I think, really important data point is that the desire for homeownership within the Latino community remains strong. And this is true even, right now, there's a lot of really discouraging news around the mortgage market. And I think we've seen articles, I know I've seen articles about a lot of folks, believing, millennials and those younger thinking, what, maybe homeownership isn't for me. I'm not saying that Latinos aren't discouraged, but if you poll Latinos, we continue to see, homeownership is the goal. Affordability and housing supply remain significant barriers in, it feels like almost every part of the country. I mean, for a long time, it felt like that was mostly a coastal issue, like in places in California. But, I talked to folks in, Texas, even the Midwest, and affordability and supply remain big barriers. And, to the earlier point of Latinos retaining their strong desire for homeownership, they're getting creative. And so we are seeing within the Latino community a willingness to move to other areas where there's affordability and where you can buy a home. And so that might mean in some markets moving to a different part of a metropolitan area. It might mean moving to another part of a state. Like if you live in San Diego, maybe you move to the Inland Empire in California, or it might even mean moving across the country. But we've seen a lot of population shifts of the Latino community moving from higher cost states like California to lower cost states. Multi-generational families is a big issue, a big trend, and Juan shared some of those stats, and that's definitely true. Latino households are more likely to have multi-generational families living together than other groups. And we're also seeing a rise in co-borrowers. And I'll also talk a little bit about this a little bit later because there's some interesting stats around co-borrower increases. Historically, Latinos have been over-indexed with FHA loan products, where Latinos historically have been about twice as likely as other demographic groups to take out an FHA loan. But we have seen in the past year an increasing use of conventional financing, which I think is good. I think, it's good to have choices and for borrowers to make what for them is the best choice. So that's some of the big picture on the data. And I'll now like to shift and tell you about the Homeownership Means Equity Initiative, which I introduced to you all a year ago. And, I'll start with kind of a little bit about the initiative, and then I'll share some updates. So to start, this is our goal. And so our big goal is to transform the economic trajectory of Latino families, to close the wealth gap, close the homeownership gap, and really the family story I shared at the start of the call is we want that story to be true for more families, and so we set a measurable goal. We are seeking to help create 4 million new Hispanic home owners by the end of this decade. It's a really big goal, but we also think it's attainable with the right policies and hopefully market conditions, in place. So, earlier I shared, some of the data points around the Latino market, but I wanted to maybe share with you next why this is important to Unidos. So I noted, Unidos, we are a civil rights organization. we work to close all the gaps. I always say, we're working. I have colleagues who are working on closing the education gaps, health gaps, looking to help people register to vote. Like we're doing a lot of really, really important work. And among all those priorities is a priority to support Latino homeownership. And this tells a story of why this is so important to Unidos. The first is that where you live matters. And there's a lot of evidence around the connection between access to quality housing and health outcomes and educational outcomes. And, there's been research noting that your zip code is more indicative of your health than your DNA code. And we also know that your zip code is often the best predictor of social mobility in the US. So we know that housing and where you live matters. A second big reason is generational wealth. And we know that for a lot of families in the US who are, entering the middle class, and particularly within the Latino community, buying a home is that first step. It's that gateway to building generational wealth. It's not the only path. It shouldn't be the only thing in your portfolio, but for a lot of families, this is the first really big investment that they make. So we want to support that. And then the last reason is that, we poll Latino consumers and Latino voters all the time, and consistently we hear homeownership is important. It's a priority. It really matters to our families. And so if it's going to be important to the Latino community, it's important to Unidos US. And so this is a little bit about why we focus on homeownership among all the other important things that we work on. So going back to the home initiative, I laid out this really big goal, 4 million new Latino homeowners by the end of the decade. Now, you certainly, if I were you, I'd be asking, well, how are you going to do that? And so the work that we're doing, it's organized across 4 pillars. The first is improving homebuyer readiness. So this includes homebuyer education and counseling, making sure families are aware and have access to any special programs, including, down payment assistance in their community. A second important area that we work on is around expanding access to credit. And I'll talk more about that in one of my examples, but I think the big picture here is that, we think there's a lot of room to modernize how we assess credit risk in this country. And we think about the measures of risk and the indicators. And a lot of the way we underwrite someone for a mortgage loan, it hasn't changed that much, in the last couple of decades. But we think about how people live their economic lives today is so different. So whether it's an increase in self-employment income, gig work, people having, multiple, side hustles, the multi-generational households, people kind of combining their resources. All of those are things that they're not formally a barrier to homeownership, but they just make it a little more challenging. It's a little harder to underwrite. And so, we think there's a lot of opportunity there. A third pillar of our work is housing supply. And I often say that right now in today's market, the number one barrier we face to closing the Latino homeownership gap is the lack of affordable housing for purchase, particularly, those entry, level homes, the starter homes that are affordable to first-time home buyers. And then the fourth area is around sustainability. So we think it's really important to get folks into the right mortgage, into the right house, because we want them to be successful. And we want them to be able to stay in their home, even as they face any financial or even, right now in the news, there's certainly natural disaster. We want to make sure that home really becomes an asset for their family, and it's something that they can pass on, either the physical structure or potentially the wealth of that asset to future generations. And so these are the 4 areas around the type of work that we do. And in terms of the how or the strategies themselves, these are our 4 buckets. And I noted at the start that we're an intermediary, we're a civil rights organization. So I like to remind folks, we're not making mortgage loans. We're not building houses. So it's like, this is really gives you a sense more about the way that a group like Unidos can influence change. And a lot of the change we're seeking to make is around changing the systems that are in place today. And so the first is investing in communities. I mentioned our affiliate network. There are a lot of organizations across the country that in their local market are doing really important work, whether it's educating consumers, building affordable housing, policy or advocacy around zoning in their local community. And, we want to support that type of effort. And so that's one area. A second is sponsoring research. And, we really feel strongly that research and data analytics to shape and inform better public policies and even market practices. There's a really strong connection there because, a policymaker isn't going to change the rules just because we ask them to. And certainly, a company like Atlantic Bay isn't going to create a new mortgage product just based on kind of a hunch. Like you want data and you want research. And so we think that's really important. Um, a third space is around storytelling and communications. That's another area that we spend a lot of time around. Fourth is policy and advocacy. We are very active in Washington, D.C. at the federal level in terms of both the regulatory work. As you all know, the mortgage business is a very regulated industry. We're often meeting with CFPB, the OCC, FHFA, and other agencies around what we think might need to change on policy. And then we also work with members of Congress and their staffs, whether it's reviewing legislation or policy platforms. And then in addition to DC, we do policy and advocacy in the 4 states that I mentioned at the start of the call, California, Arizona, Texas, and Florida. And then the last piece is convening stakeholders. It's really amazing to me sometimes, like the power of bringing people together. Like you convene policymakers, consumer advocates, mortgage lenders, realtors, like all the different parts of the stakeholders in the work that we do. You bring them together in a room with kind of a common question and, identify what is that shared, what is the problem that we all agree on to solve. It's often amazing to me how much can get done that way. So that's a lot of what we do also. So all of that is just a little bit of a background on what is the Home Initiative, what are we focused on, how are we doing the work? And I'd like to switch now to talking about some highlights from the past year. And the work that I outlined, there's a lot that we've done. And so I didn't want to give you guys just like a laundry list of every activity and everything we've done, but I thought I would focus in on 2 areas that I think are particularly impactful and that I thought might be of interest to all of you. And the first is some research that we've done in partnership with the Urban Institute around credit access. And the second is some examples around what we're doing around addressing the housing supply crisis that it's facing a lot of communities. So I'll start with access to credit. And we work a lot with Urban Institute. They're a think tank based in Washington, D.C. They're a large think tank. They do research around a lot of different areas. They're nonpartisan. They don't do advocacy, so they just do research for research's sake, and then others use their findings for advocacy. And we've partnered with them with their they have an office which is the Housing Finance Policy Center that's focused around mortgage policy. And we've worked with them on a few different papers. Earlier this year, we published with them a paper on I-10 mortgage lending. So if that's of interest to anyone, that's up on our website and their website. More recently, they published a paper on the top 3 denial reasons that Latinos face when applying for mortgage credit. And they unpacked each of those denial reasons to really kind of understand better, like how is this more uniquely affecting Latinos? And then there's some recommendations. And so, you guys, none of these reasons will be a surprise to you. The headline is the top 3 denial reasons. It's DTI ratio, credit history, and then, related to DTI is down payment. But I'll share with you just some of the key findings for each of those. So when the Urban Institute unpacked the DTI ratio denial reason, which is the top reason, they found a few interesting things. One is for Latinos, mortgage debt is a really high share of the overall household debt. interestingly, before you calculate, mortgage, Latinos actually have lower DTI ratios than other groups. But when you bring in, the mortgage, suddenly it's much more significant than for most other types of other groups. And one reason to explain that is that Latinos tend to live in higher cost markets. And so the DTI for Latinos is more sensitive to home prices and, of course, knowing more recently, interest rate increases. And another really interesting finding we found is that while Latinos are more likely to live in multi-generational households, and while Latinos also have the greatest share of multi-earners in a household, Latinos are less likely than other groups to apply with co-borrowers. And so I thought that was really fascinating because it seemed counterintuitive to me. And this is one where we're talking with Urban about maybe doing some additional research to understand that better. But what I think is some good news is, based on the recent NAREP report that Juan shared, is we're beginning to see a slight increase in the share of Latinos who apply with a co-borrower. So, and again, just knowing the structure of Latino households, I think it makes a lot of sense and it might help address some of the affordability issues. So moving on to credit history. So Latinos are more likely to have lower credit scores or to be credit invisible compared to other racial and ethnic groups. And, there's, I think, a lot of reasons to explain that. One is Latinos have one of the higher shares of being unbanked. And so our community has less interactions or more limited interactions with the formal financial system, which I think, if you were to kind of be part of that, there's sort of a natural progression toward building, a credit score and credit history. And then certainly, you can't ignore that discrimination, still remains in credit. And there's also a lot of, cultural differences. I think, for those of you who are Latino on this call, I'm sure you can think of family members who believe any type of credit is a bad thing. That was certainly the story of my grandfather, who I mentioned earlier. He didn't believe in credit. He paid all of his bills in cash. He probably would be, the best credit risk, but he probably wouldn't have had a credit score, and so, but he was someone who always paid his bills on time and paid them in cash and just didn't believe in credit. I think that's changing, like the longer the generations are in the US, we certainly become more American in many ways, including our views toward credit. And then a third area is lack of trust. This is still something that we see in a lot of the polling that we do, and this is more related to banking institutions more generally, not specific to mortgage, but just around, banking access. So the third area we dove into with Urban was around down payment, and unpacking why it is, this is a big, it's connected with the fact that Latinos, we are more likely to take out an FHA loan. Certainly lower down payment mortgage products are really important in the Latino community. Saving up for that down payment is really hard. One is that there is that lack of intergenerational wealth, just because historically we haven't had, really large homeownership rates or savings rates or wealth. Latino families have just 1/5 the wealth of white families in this country. And that hasn't changed. You've seen the wealth has increased within the Hispanic community in recent years, but it's also increased overall. So the rate of difference remains pretty steady. And another interesting fact is that over half of Latino renters are cost burdened, which means that they pay over 1/3 of their income on rent. And that's compared to 45% of white renters, which I think is still high, but for Latino renters, it's much higher. And of course, if your rent is really high, it makes it difficult to save for that down payment. And so, this, we know, the high LTV products are really important, and Latino borrowers tend to have a greater share of being in high LTV products than other communities. So switching a little bit to recommendations, because we did have a few, and some of these are making up for Unidos, our advocacy push. So on the DTI ratio, we we're doing some advocacy around capturing non-traditional income. And so I mentioned earlier around self-employed and gig workers. Latinos have one of the highest shares of the community across other groups who are self-employed. And so we think that's really important. We also have talked with experts in Washington around how we look at credit scores. So if you have two borrowers, can you give a greater weight to the person with the higher credit score as opposed to doing an average or something else? So this might also, we think, help encourage co-borrowers, because we suspect at least one of the reasons why there's a lower rate of co-borrowing among Latino applicants is perhaps the other borrower, maybe their credit score is lower and then they wouldn't be eligible. In terms of credit history, we've been doing some work with Fannie Mae and FHFA and others, and FHA, advocating for positive rent reporting. The evidence we've seen around some of the pilots is that, Latinos who are renting and they start, counting their on-time rent payments toward their credit score, they see an increase. So that we think is a really good opportunity. We also think there might be some opportunities around expanding cash flow underwriting, especially, when we think about, folks with, multiple income sources. And if this is all documented with bank statements, if there's sort of a recurring trend around income that's hitting the bank account, that might be, an alternative way to assess credit risk. We think with this recommendation, though, there needs to be a consumer awareness campaign around rent reporting and sharing bank data, because again, back to the trust issue, some, folks might opt out of these opportunities, not understanding what the benefits might be. And then on down payment, it's often shocking to me, like there are a lot of really great programs out there and people don't realize it, and we know that a lot of people still believe you need 20% down to buy a home. And so there's a lot of either myths or just people just aren't aware. So we think there's still a lot of room for awareness around down payment programs. We know there are a lot of lender products out there around like special purpose credit programs that have some really, helpful terms that can help, especially first time buyers. We're big supporters of first time home buyer down payment assistance programs. And another place that we've been looking at a little bit more is savings accounts specifically for down payments that have a tax advantage. So similar to like a retirement account or a 529 account for college, could we create an account specifically for down payment that provides some tax incentives or maybe even a matching program? And there are a handful of states that offer this at the state level. We would love to see something like this at the federal level, especially if there's some kind of, match that goes along with it. So I'm going to shift now. So that's an example of the research we've done around access to credit and how it's informing our advocacy that we're doing. And I'm going to shift now to talking about housing supply. And I noted earlier that Unidos, we're not a home builder. So when we think about, okay, what can we do to help address the housing supply shortage that we're facing in the country, especially on the more affordable side? And certainly there's things around policy and advocacy that we're doing at the federal level and probably more impactfully at the state level and local level. But another thing we decided to do is we launched a national competition to identify and recognize community-based solutions that are helping to increase housing supply, particularly for that first-time buyer or low moderate income buyer. And so we thought, okay, this is something we can do. We can set aside some money for sub-grants, help fund some of this work in local communities, and then showcase it. We're doing a lot of promotion of this work and exemplifying this about solutions because, depending on who you ask, we have somewhere between 3 and 5 million homes that we're short in this country. That's our housing supply gap, is somewhere between 3 and 5 million. And that seems like a really huge, overwhelming number. How are we going to ever get there? But at the end of the day, we're going to get there one house at a time, one community at a time. And so this is our way of sort of contributing to that. So we launched this competition. We awarded a little over $1 million in grants, and we had winners across the country, including Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia. They are in rural, urban, suburban communities, and they're doing some really interesting things. And, there were certainly some trends that we saw in terms of some of the specific things that the groups are focused on. And, I'm going to share with you just two examples and of groups. And I'll just point out the picture that you see there on the left. That is a modular home that's infill construction in Chicago in the back of the yard community. Our nonprofit partner there, they have a partnership with the city where they can buy vacant lots for a little bit of money. Not they do have to pay something, but it's not very much. And then they work with a modular firm to place these homes in these communities, and then they market them to folks in the neighborhood. And so that's an example of one of the houses. But let's turn to Milwaukee because I love this story. And so via CDC in Milwaukee, they saw this challenge. So in Milwaukee, which I'm not too familiar with, but maybe some of you on the call might know it better. The city of Milwaukee has a lot of these very narrow lots that make it really challenging to build, but a lot of them are vacant. And so this nonprofit, they identified a solution. They created this proprietary blueprint to build these small homes. So the home you see here, it's about 1,100 square feet. It's a small home, really beautiful, new. And it fits perfectly in these narrow lots in Milwaukee. And with support from the city and with the kind of the blueprint that they were able to create in the smaller scale, they are able to target this housing to folks who make 80% or below of area median income, which is about $12 to $15 an hour. And as they were building these homes or starting to get prepared to build them, in talking with their local community, one of the populations that they identified as being really disadvantaged in terms of being able to afford to buy a house were early child care providers. So if any of you are familiar with preschool teachers and early child care providers, you know that they don't make a lot of money, but they do really important work, and they're really it's important. Like we have a child care shortage in this country, and so we want to be able to support child care workers in local communities. And so they are focusing the marketing of these homes to child care workers in some of these neighborhoods. And they're selling these houses for $100,000. So they're affordable to these child care providers. So it's really amazing. And, the work that they're doing, having done now these proprietary blueprints, in past years, they've typically have built 3 to 5 homes per year, but now they'll be able to double their volume now that they've done a couple of these and they have the blueprint. It's almost like a formula, and they're able to do it much more quickly. So we're really excited to support this example. And then another example in California, and this is NPHS in the Inland Empire in California, which is probably, I would say, California is a challenging market in terms of supply and affordability. But if there is a bright spot, it's the Inland Empire. And, it's like San Bernardino area. And the group there, they had certainly the challenge of supply and affordability, like a lot of communities, but also climate was increasingly a big issue just between excessive heat, wildfires, that, all of those things. And so what they did is they partnered with a few other entities and created a factory in their area to build factory-built homes. And they designed these homes to be climate adaptive. And so they have a lot of energy efficient materials, solar power, and they're able to withstand a lot of the severe weather conditions that are facing this part of the state. And so this is an example of one of the houses with one of the families that got to move in, a single mom with her 4 beautiful sons. And again, this is an example of a group, building housing that's affordable to low and moderate income aspiring homeowners. And in this case, the case in Milwaukee, they're working with the education sector to address a specific population that, they wanted to, include. And in this case, we have a group that's focused on climate resiliency and how they're building homes. So before I close out, I did want to pivot a little bit and talk about the election because that's right around the corner and it's certainly top of mind. And I mentioned earlier that Unidos does a lot of polling of Latino consumers and Latino voters. And I wanted to just share just a couple of things that I thought were really interesting. So we did this poll about a year ago, so at the start of the election cycle last fall. And at the time, we asked, Latino voters, like, what is your top issue? And at the time, housing was number 5. And it was the first time that housing was a top 5 issue for Latino voters since we've been doing these polls, which I don't know how long we've been doing them, but at least, gosh, 15, maybe even 20 years. And then interestingly, when we asked, that the number one issue, which will not surprise you, was the cost of living. And when we asked folks who identified cost of living as their number one issue, like, well, what specifically like about cost of living, most of them cited, I think it was like 65%, the top thing was housing. And so housing is actually was on there a couple different ways. So we just recently, about a month and a half ago, did the poll again. So this is just from last fall, and housing moved from number 5 to number 3. And then still within that cost of living, which remains a top issue, if you unpack that, housing is driving a lot of that concern. And so just to show that I think this is true, honestly, we talk about there's no such thing as the Latino vote. There are Latino voters. And so what you'll find is that Latino voters, like most voters, that all the polls that I've seen in this country were very concerned with economic issues and specifically housing within that. And I flag it because, again, it's intuitive, I think, to all of us who work in the housing space. We probably have been, crying about this for much longer than the polls and the newspapers have been writing about it. But we're now seeing it much more like if you listen to any of the debates, the presidential, the vice presidential, if you look at the messaging coming out from the campaigns, policymakers and those who are running for office are talking a lot more about housing. And so I don't know what's going to happen in the election, in November, either at the federal election or, there's a lot of really important state races happening too. But I feel very encouraged that policymakers are really focused on housing, and I'm hoping we'll see some good policy changes around increasing housing supply, expanding access to credit, particularly for those who have been historically left out. And so I think that's a really great sign. So there's just the key takeaways from the poll. I also have a link here to, if you want to see the full poll, there's a lot of data points. You can even look back historically at other prior year polls. I also wanted to flag that we did a poll about, gosh, it was sometime this summer around Latino banking and financial health. And there's some really interesting takeaways there. And so, please, you're welcome to, these are available on our website if you wanted to check out those polls and some of the findings. And so, closing out, what's next for us? I mean, certainly I mentioned the election, we're paying close attention. We think there's a lot of policy opportunity at the federal, state level, as well as taxes. We're going to do some storytelling. The research that we're working on with Urban, we're going to be hosting a research symposium in January with Urban. And then we're also with Urban, we'll be doing a paper on the intersections of climate change on Latino homeownership, which, right now with all of the recent hurricanes is certainly very top of mind. And then lastly, here's a QR code if you want to visit our website that gives you more about what I've talked about. We have a quarterly newsletter that you can sign up for. And yeah, with that, and hopefully I left us a little bit of time for questions.
Awesome. Laura, thank you. Gracias. Gracias. Thank you
De
so
nada.
much. The information was amazing. We have some great questions. Do you have time to answer a couple of these questions?
Of course, happy to. Yeah, I wasn't
Or
tracking the chat, so you'll have to help me
no,
with the
you're
questions.
fine.
So
Thank you so much. Everything, this is incredible. And let me ask you, do we have access to this presentation? Maybe we can share it.
yeah, I shared it at the end. So you have my permission to,
Okay.
if you want to circulate it and all of that, that is fine.
Thank you so much. So I wanted to ask you a question first. We have some really good questions here. I'm going to pick 2 or 3 of these questions, but me personally, I wanted to ask you, in your own opinion, your own words, Why is so important to educate and to encourage Latinos to buy homes? Like any other demographic, but why specifically Latinos?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So, I talked about how important homeownership is within the Latino community. Certainly, I talked to anyone in my family, and I think anecdotally that's a thing. But on the other side of it, and something I didn't talk as much about, is demographically. I did note that over the next 20 years plus, Latinos will be 70% of net new home buyers. And
Yep.
so increasingly, Latinos are a larger share of the population. We're a larger share of those in the prime home buying year. Our educational attainment is increasing. And if we don't start to close or narrow the Latino homeownership gap, what's going to happen is as we're more and more of the population, our nation's overall homeownership rate will decline. And we know how important, housing is about 20% of the nation's GDP, and that includes all housing. But certainly home lending, mortgage, home building, all of that for purchase, for ownership is a significant share. And so if we don't support Latino home ownership, we're going to see an overall decline in our nation's home ownership rate. That's going to impact our GDP and be bad for the economy. So I would like to say that supporting Latino home ownership is good for Latino families and communities, but it's also important
No.
for our country and our economy.
Okay. Thank you so much, Laura. I have another question here. It says, is the increase in denials in any way attribute to an increase in applications?
Um, that's a great question. So my intuition tells me yes. I have to look at the data to know for sure, but I do think that we have seen an increase in applications, and I do think like that. 2020 year was such a tricky year with like interest rates and all the movement, and so but that's a great question. I'm gonna look that up, but my intuition tells me that I think that is part of it because we are seeing increasingly Latinos are seeking to become homeowners, so it would make sense that the application rate is increasing.
Awesome. Guys, and if you guys got more questions, please send your questions. I got another one here. It says, does Unidos US provide funding for affordable housing solutions organizations?
Yes. So we're a nonprofit. So we receive funding. We have funding from the federal government we're a housing counseling intermediary. So we pass on a lot of that funding to community-based partners who do the housing counseling. And then we also receive funding from corporate partners, and a pretty big share of the funding that we collect, we end up passing through to community-based groups. So some of the examples that I shared, like via CDC in Milwaukee and NPHS and Inland Empire, we provided them with sub grants to support their work. It's not the only thing because it's a lot of money to build a house, so we're
It
not
is.
doing all of it, but we're contributing to it with grants.
Awesome. And then the last question here, unless you guys, again, have more questions, are there any national homeownership workshops that work with potential buyers to look at all their options?
Yes. So I mentioned we're a housing counseling intermediary. So we have groups, I think it's now 37 agencies who provide pre-purchase counseling in communities across the country. And so they're working with families individually because a lot of times the products or the programs that are offered are unique to a specific market. So each of these, so depending on the community, and if someone wants to follow up later, like depending if you work in a specific market or community, I'm happy to share information about places there that offer that.
Perfect. I think that's all we have today, Laura. No
Okay.
more questions here on my end. Thank you so much for being here today. I know this is the second time you join us in Atlantic Bay. I hope there's more to come.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
we'll see how I did if I get invited back again.
no, you always do awesome, and everybody here loves you, Laura. So we're doing great. So thank you so much, guys. Please, if you have any questions, reach out to Thea, to me, to everybody who joined the call. So thank you so much. Okay,
Great. Thank you. Thanks,
bye,
everyone.
guys.
Have a great day.
Bye bye.
Bye.